review, or maybe you missed a day, but this is going to be part 1 of Unit 1. This will go through slide 12 or 13, basically up to the Constitutional, or through the Constitutional Convention, or up to it, we'll see. The next one will be sort of some bedrock principles ingrained in American philosophy, and then the third one will be the big one, and we'll go through the entirety of the Constitution. Each one of those will be solo, so, I'll tell you where to go from here. All right, Foundations of American Democracy. Here we go. We talked about this a little bit already in class where I think everybody was there, so I will make this one brief. The key things to pull out of this slide are this right here. This definition: government is institutions and or officials organized to establish and carry out public policy, as we'll talk about in a little bit. That is the will of the people as far as the United States goes. And the two things you need to do that are right here: power and legitimacy. So power is the ability to enforce your actions. So yes, we've passed a law. Now, as the government, we can enact that law and make sure that it is followed, that we prosecute those who don't follow it, and that the benefits of that law are brought to the people. Legitimacy is sort of the behind-the-scenes side of that, right? It's, okay, I've said I'm going to do this. Can I actually do it? And that proves that you're legitimate. We have elected you as the president. You have promised to do something. Have you done it? If the answer is no, and we the people don't see that you've made a good faith effort to do that, that undermines your legitimacy. If you are, undermining American institutions or things like the Constitution, that also hurts your legitimacy, because then the people don't see you as their voice, as either their elected representative from a legislature standpoint, or as a chief executive from, in our case, the presidential standpoint. So remember, legitimacy is how trusted you are, and power is your ability to enforce policies, bring about change, that sort of thing. As always with any of this stuff, as you're watching, if you have questions, write them down. You can throw them in the comments if you want, or probably better, just ask them in class. All right, let's get rolling on to philosophy here. Okay, 4 philosophers that we're going to talk about for American democracy. We've got Thomas Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Locke, and Baron Montesquieu. We'll start with Hobbes, my favorite. Hobbes is a pessimist. He is the guy who gets the ball rolling on this stuff. And Hobbes is not there for any form of representational government. He would look at America's government today and be like, whoa, no, not what I'm talking about. Hobbes wants a king, pure and simple. He wants a chief executive. He doesn't care about a judiciary. He doesn't care about a legislature, because everything he thinks can be done through this chief executive. Because Hobbes's big thing is this social contract. We live in a state of nature until a government is established. That state of nature means we are at a default. Think people wandering the plains of Africa into the Middle East with no form of government whatsoever. They don't have agriculture, way, way back at the beginning of time. Okay, so their lives are inherently free. There are no restrictions on them from a legal standpoint. You can do whatever you want. You can live peacefully by yourself. You can go raid neighboring settlements and, kill them, enslave them, do whatever, conquer them. But what social contract says in the Eye of Hobbes, writing in his masterpiece Leviathan, is that you are going to give up your ability to go murder your neighbor without legal repercussions, or rob your neighbor without legal repercussions. Your neighbor is also going to give that up. You're both giving this up in exchange for protection. You are going to give up that freedom to your chief executive, in Hobbes's eyes, a king, in exchange for the king making sure that your neighbor doesn't break into your house in the middle of the night and kill you so he can steal your goats. But you also can no longer break into your neighbor's house and steal their goats. That is the essence of social contract theory. Because otherwise, if you're just living in a state of nature, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It's an awesome quote. I've used it a lot. So, to stop the damage from a state of nature, we can now, thanks to social contract theory, live together. We can better ourselves because our property will be protected. We will be protected from violence, and we will live longer as a result of that. That's all thanks to, in Hobbes's mind, social contract theory and the people giving up some, if not all, of their freedoms in exchange for having the protection of a strong ruler. All right, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he's got 2 things for us. 1, is this idea of the general will. We're all familiar with this. This is basically what elections are inside the United States. This is what calling your congressman or your senator does when you're upset about something. The people as an aggregate, so all 360 million, whatever the U.S. population's at right now, have, if we took all of their opinions and we averaged it out, have something that they want accomplished. That is essentially what the general will is. So we're going to work towards that common goal of making America a strong, profitable nation that is safe and is able to give its citizens a life that they want. However, that is an average. The general will is everybody put together. There are corrupt individuals who are self-interested that are going to work against that general will. So we need to make sure that the general will is followed. And the best way to do that is to not just put one person in charge like Hobbes wanted, but rather a number of people in charge. And by doing that, again, we can sort of average out those corrupt, self-interested individuals. Their personal goals will be washed out by kind of the personal goals of everybody else. When we look at Fed 10, and when we look at Brutus 1, a Federalist paper and an anti-Federalist paper, both of those are going to bring up this idea of, how do we sort of avoid the malign influences in politics? So this is not a new idea by the time our founding fathers get around to it. It's been around for a little while. So what Rousseau says is the key to this is you have to establish a popular sovereignty. So popular, of the populace, sovereignty, leadership. The government will act in concert with the general will. They will take their cues from the general will. Hey, people, what do you want? Okay, we're going to do this. That will then preserve their legitimacy. But if that trust, that legitimacy is violated, then the government itself is illegitimate, and it is the role of the people, not of the government, of the people, to rise up, overthrow that current form of government, and install one that works better. This is what Thomas Jefferson predicts is going to happen. He's going to say roughly every 20 years, the American Constitution and American government is going to be just such a cesspit that we're going to need to do the hard reboot. And, from time to time, the Tree of Liberty must be cleansed with the blood of patriots. Obviously, that has not happened to the extreme degree that Jefferson is talking about, but he's pulling this idea from Rousseau. And there is no question, Thomas Jefferson is the best read of any of the founding fathers. He did a lot of it. His implementation is a little bit iffy, but the man's well read and brings a lot of this to the fore, and then is able to help other founding fathers, especially Madison, really kind of tap into this and, in their case, better articulate what Jefferson's trying to get at. All right, so John Locke, you've read this, at least you've read part of the Second Treatise on Government. I think you've read chapter 9 in there. And this idea that men, and in this case we're talking about humanity at this point, in Locke's mind, he's not progressive in gender roles by any idea. He's literally talking about men. But for our purposes and for America's purposes, we are just talking about citizens. You're entitled to natural rights. Life, liberty, property. You get to live your life. Nobody has the right to come and kill you. Nobody has the right to imprison you without due process. And nobody gets to take your stuff. This comes across as a little, as we will see when we look at the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution later on. This comes across as a little hoity-toity, and that's one of the reasons that we're then going to cut out property and exchange it for pursuit of happiness. But do not get it twisted. The Founding Fathers don't particularly care about the pursuit of happiness in comparison to that protection of property. It's that property, that taxation, that drives us to the American Revolution in the first point, right? So, Locke is also going to articulate a need for a rule of law. It cannot just be a unilateral decision made by a chief executive. There needs to be a written code of laws that the people are going to follow that will be enforced by an impartial judiciary. Absolute monarchy is inconsistent with civil society. This is kind of the point he's making with the rule of law here, is one person making all the calls is such a myopic, a short-sighted viewpoint that the country is not going to be able to function well. The people's voices won't be heard because the only voice being heard is that of the absolute monarch, and that is untenable. He does not want that. We're not going to have that. Founding Fathers love that. Lastly, and this is a doozy here, make sure you get this down, this concept of republicanism, an independent, limited government of the people that is done via representation. I will ask you this in class when we talk about this week, or last week, whenever you're listening to this. But this is the key here. America is not a democracy, and the people that tell you it's a democracy are wrong. We are a representative form of government. That means that we elect people to speak for us. If we were a democracy, then everybody would have a completely equal voice and nothing would get done because you'd have 360 people all throwing their 2 cents in. How do you figure that out? Instead, you use a representative form of government. We choose people to go speak for us, to advocate for our state or our district's general will. What do the people of Montana want? It is up to Representative Gianforte and Senators Daines and Tester to articulate that idea to the rest of the country. All right, lastly, we've got Baron Montesquieu. I wish we had time to read this because it's awesome, but it's also incredibly long. If you want it, I will get you a copy of it. He's going to take Locke's ideas and really expand on them and articulate them. So, we've got this idea of separation of powers. Remember, we can't have that absolute monarchy with unilateral decision-making from one person. Instead, we need to split it up amongst a judicial, a representative, and an executive branch. Does that sound familiar? It should. It's what America has. He goes on to talk about 3 types of government: monarchy, republic, and despotism. For our purposes here, we don't really need to get into that. America is going to choose the middle path with a republic. Monarchy is essentially a dictatorship of one person due to hereditary stuff. Despotism is a little more flexible, but basically the people don't have a voice in despotism. One way or another, they don't. So the key for Montesquieu here is the separation of powers, that you need an impartial judiciary to rule on the laws, you need elected representatives to come up and pass the laws, and you need a chief executive or group of executives to enforce those laws. So if you think about the Department of Justice, the FBI, all of that stuff in the United States, those are all part of the executive branch. Therefore, they technically answer to the president as to how laws should be enforced. You need to think no further back into American history to see how this can not work than the Trail of Tears is. The Supreme Court passes a ruling in a case called Worcester versus Georgia that says that Andrew Jackson cannot forcibly remove Native Americans, the Cherokee, from northern Georgia, and Andrew Jackson basically throws up the birds and says, all right, Chief Justice Marshall has made his ruling, let us see him enforce it. It comes down to all of these 3 groups working in concert, or at least 2 of them if one is refusing to sort of share the load. So again, here's another example, kind of the opposite of that, is Dwight Eisenhower with school integration. Is Brown versus Board of Education is passed by the Warren Court, and it is eventually up to Dwight Eisenhower to forcibly integrate Little Rock public schools at the point of a gun because the states are not comporting with a decision that is in line with the Constitution, and therefore they're acting illegally. We will talk way more about that later, but that is the crux of separation of powers right there. Moving on. Declaration of Independence. You guys are going to read this week by yourselves. It's broken up for you. You've presumably read this before. So this is just sort of how we get there. This is a little bit of background information. Continental Congress says, all right, things are not going well. King George III, as well as kind of losing his mind due to probably syphilis and some other stuff, is being a bad king. So Thomas Jefferson, along with Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, and to a lesser extent, my boy Roger Sherman and a guy named Robert Livingston. These are the 5 of them up there giving their book report to the Continental Congress. You need to articulate our grievances. Oh, hey, look at that. It's almost like I wrote this myself. So explain why we have a problem with Great Britain. And in the same step, say, okay, look, we've tried and tried and tried. This is why we're done with you. So we're breaking up with you. Here's the reason. As I said, largely written by Thomas Jefferson. Franklin and Adams are going to do the most leaning over Jefferson's shoulder and kind of making edits as they go along. And Sherman and Livingston are just there to kind of throw in their 2 cents from time to time and make sure that Jefferson does not go full Thomas Jefferson, which is a little, let's say, florid. And these ideas are going to come largely from Locke and Rousseau, especially that life, liberty, and, in this case, pursuit of happiness. Because the absolutism of George III, even with a parliament there, is not cutting the mustard, folks. So let's keep rolling. There are three types of democracy. Boy, do you need to know this. The AP board is very, very forthright about the fact that you need to know these three types of democracy. You'll see it in your notes as well. Make sure you get this stuff down. Our first option is a participatory democracy. This is kind of what I was ragging on a little bit earlier. This is more the Athenian democracy that you've heard about, where, you know, people would go up to the Acropolis, and as long as they were a citizen, they could have their voice heard, and they could cast a vote for whatever the issue of the day was. So everybody has a say in a participatory democracy. And the problem with this is it's basically impossible to do in a practical fashion. We are too big of a country to make this work. The only way you really see this in the U.S. is the concept of ballot measures, which a good number of states have right now. We had it, I mean, you'll see it at a local level as well. But in a ballot measure, you have to go around, your district or your state, whatever it is, and collect a number of signatures, some percentage of the citizenry there, that says, hey, we would be interested in this passing. So the kind of the most famous ballot measure in recent American history are the swath of them across the United States about legalizing recreational marijuana. It started out in California with medicinal, and it's expanded to recreational. But there, the people of the state basically say, hey, representatives, you haven't been pulling your weight on this. You've been ignoring the general will of the people. So we want to put this on a ballot. So it's not going to pass automatically. It's going to go on a ballot, and then during the next election, it will be on there, and the people will then get to vote, and then the representative body, be that the town, the county, or the state, will have their legislature come up with an articulated legal version of whatever that law is. So that's what a ballot measure is. That's as close as we're going to get to straight up participatory democracy inside the United States. Next up, we've got a pluralist democracy. This is sort of the happy medium between the two. This says there are a bunch of different groups with different viewpoints, especially in a large country. So the will of the people is going to win out, right? We talked about that common will goal. And they will then, by the law of averages, enact what is best overall. Think of this as a group-based democracy. Parties are sort of the go-to answer for this, but do not only think of this as parties. It is imperative that you also think of these groups as interest groups, so the Sierra Club, the NRA. Social groups, be that, the Elks Club or the Daughters of the American Revolution, and even business organizations. I don't have a great option for a business organization just within the U.S. at the moment, but think of it as like, all the small store owners in a state, something like that. But these are groups that all have a goal, right? The Republicans want to accomplish certain things. The Democrats want to accomplish certain things. Everybody that owns a gas station in America wants to accomplish certain things. So those groups will, one way or another, find their way into the political process, be it electing a member, or in this case, funding a member of a political party to go speak for them. The idea here is there's so many voices that pluralism is going to get most of those voices heard one way or another. It doesn't necessarily mean that those changes that the various groups want will be enacted, but at least those will be heard, which is the first step. And then we'll get into that in way more depth later on. And then lastly, this is sort of the cynical one. America, honestly, at this point, probably falls in between these. And that's elitist democracy, where an upper class or powerful individuals hold most of the power and manipulate the lower classes. Now, don't freak out here. We are still well closer to pluralism than elitist. But with the amount of money that the wealthy in any country can give to political campaigns, especially in the U.S.'s case, after a case that we'll talk about later called Citizens United, they have a very noticeable impact on the U.S. People like the Koch brothers are sort of one of your big groups that you will have heard about. They're very rich. They fund all sorts of stuff, all sorts of political groups. They definitely lean to the right. They're not exclusively a political group, though, however. They also funded a new wing on the American Museum of Natural History, all about evolution in D.C. Um, but the issue with elite democracies is that 1% means that at most you've got, what, 33 million people calling the shots for a nation of almost 400 million, and corporations behind that as well, that are going to drive the rulemaking rather than that general will that you will see come out of elected representatives in a pluralist democracy. This is considered more of a trustee form of government, where basically these people are going to argue, well, we have the most time and the best educations because we're already wealthy. Therefore, we know what's best for everybody. We'll call the shots. I mean, if you look at the first generation of American democracy, is the vast majority of them are wealthy landowners, right? That are making the calls for a relatively uneducated mass of American citizens. That'll change over time, but not completely. This trustee form of government still exists to a degree with the Electoral College that we'll talk about when we get into the Constitution in a little while. So America is a pluralist democracy with hints of elitist democracy here and there, and the occasional hint of participatory, but pluralism. All right, Articles of Confederation. I assume you remember this from last year with U.S. history, and also we're reading it this week, and we're going to talk about it a wee bit. So, very brief here. A confederal form of government, a confederacy, is an association of sovereign states or community. The key here is association. Association implies loose, and that's what the Articles of Confederation want. Remember, the Articles of Confederation go in to effect basically right after the Declaration of Independence. See, 1777. And it basically says, yeah, America needs a way for all the states to get together and talk and plan ways to fight the revolution and pay for the army that is fighting the revolution, and also negotiate with France. But we don't want anything that's going to situate power in one specific spot. So even this representative form of government is going to be incredibly weak to the point of being hamstrung and ineffective. There's not a lot good to say about the Articles of Confederation. So very briefly, here's your upsides to it over here. You're not going to have a tyrant. You're not going to have to worry about a King George. You've got a limited government, so you don't need to worry about the sort of rotten borough situation that is happening over in England at the time, where it's just a couple representatives that are in their seats for life, and they're the ones that pull all the strings. States have control over every aspect of government rather than a national government making all the calls and dictating to the states. Instead, it's the other way around. The states are dictating to a national government. It doesn't go well. There's one other thing you can add in here if you want that doesn't come about till the very end of the Articles of Confederation, and that's the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. That's going to, well, we'll talk about it later, but that is one more pro you could put in there, is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Okay, so why are the Articles of Confederation so terrible? Why am I bagging on them? First, there really is no central government. There's technically an elected leader who has virtually no power, and the power is so disparate that basically nothing's going to happen. There's no permanent standing army. They have to call an army up. So if something were to happen, like, say, the British were to invade via Canada and upstate New York, you couldn't just call up the army that's hanging out at West Point or whatever and say, all right, you boys need to get up there right away. Instead, they would need to gather the militias, organize them, and then head up. And by that point, I don't know, a good chunk of the lake country up in northern New York is gone. There's no power to tax on a large scale. This is a massive issue. One of the things that, like, if we were to say, for example, an army runs on its stomach. That's an aphorism that's been used for years. That if you can't feed your troops, they're not going to be able to fight effectively. If we take that to a larger scale, a nation marches on its taxes. If a country can't pay for stuff, there goes its power, there goes its legitimacy, because it can't enact any sort of legislation, it can't build infrastructure, it can't pay for troops, it can't pay for civil servants. That's a problem. So they were given the power to issue taxes. However, they don't have the power to collect those taxes. They rely solely on the goodness of the various state governments that have joined the Confederacy to pitch in their taxes. The American Confederacy, or the Confederate States of America, whatever you want to call them, the South, the losers in the Civil War, ran into this exact same problem. By the end of the war, certain states in the South, I think it's Virginia, literally does not have enough uniforms to put on the backs of the soldiers. and they go to Georgia and they're like, hey, you've got a bunch of uniforms and nobody's fighting there, what with General Sherman wrecking shop. Can you send us some uniforms? And Georgia's like, nah, man, these are our uniforms. You can't tell us what to do. We're our own country. We just happen to be friends because we're both Confederates. This is essentially the problem with the Confederacy, is each state calls its own shots, and unless they can all work in lockstep, we're talking 13 out of 13 states in this context, nothing is going to get done. Also, there's no federal currency. There's no national currency. Every state has its own currency. So imagine being a trader and going from, Georgia or South Carolina up to, Massachusetts or New York. Is every time you're traveling through, you're going to have to change your money. Imagine trading internationally. It's a nightmare. Those two things combined are just the worst. But I do want you to keep an eye on all of this stuff, because when we get to the Constitution next, we're going to see that the Founding Fathers, James Madison, looks at this and basically uses it as like a shopping list and just goes through it and is like, okay, there's an issue, check, I fixed it. There's another issue, check, I fixed it. There's another issue, check, I fixed it. So think of the Articles of Confederation as basically America's growing pains. We take a shot at the freest form of government we can, as close to this participatory democracy as we can, but it's going to be a failure. All right, so the Confederation's Congress, the representative national quote-unquote body put together by the Articles of Confederation, is, like my picture down there says, useless. They don't have a power to tax. The executive that is elected to be the president of the Confederation's Congress has no executive power. There really is no judiciary power. The one good thing we have to come out of it, like I said a couple minutes ago, is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. It gets refreshed in 1789, but 1787 is fine for you. So, two big things here. First, it says that the national government, so originally the Confederation's Congress, and then this will be grandfathered into the Constitution, has control of expansion and territories as well, which means that later on it'll be the federal government's call whether or not they want to allow slavery into the Louisiana territory, into California territory, all that. You remember the Civil War. We're not going to dive into it here. But that's the first big thing, is the federal government has control over territories. To this day, Puerto Rico answers directly to Congress because that's the federal government. The second thing it does is it outlaws slavery in said territories. It would have to be overridden. It's never going to get overridden. So this is going to put a massive crimp in the Southern lifestyle moving forward, because they simply aren't going to legally be able to expand into a territory until that territory becomes a state. All right, so there's the Confederation's Congress. As this is all happening towards the end, this is going to happen in Massachusetts up in 1786. Here's the deal. Taxation in Massachusetts is a weird thing. It's not working particularly well. And one of the things that happened was Massachusetts active duty military in the Revolution had been told that they would be given sweetheart deals on farmland in western Massachusetts. I don't know if you've ever been to Massachusetts or remember the Pilgrims. Farming in Massachusetts is a nightmare. It's hard scrabble and there's rocks everywhere. It is hard to farm in there, which means it's hard to turn a profit. This is subsistence farming at its best. So, state judges in Massachusetts, because remember, no federal judiciary at this point under the Articles of Confederation, state judges start repossessing the lands of the veterans that had been given them for cheap by the state government because they haven't been paying their taxes on them. So, led by a guy named Daniel Shays, the farmers start to come together. Remember, these are veterans or family members of veterans. They know what they're doing, and they start to march across the state towards Boston. They're breaking into state courthouses as they go, destroying court records. Essentially the plot of that Die Hard movie that came out like 15 years ago where Bruce Willis rides a plane. They're erasing credit records, basically. It's the end of Fight Club. Destroying court records, and they're also intimidating judges. And intimidating there is a euphemism. They're threatening to kill them. They're beating the hell out of them. They're tarring and feathering them. And the rest of the country is starting to kind of look over its shoulder at Massachusetts and be like, guys, what's going on? Like, you should be stopping this. Eventually, the state militia in eastern Massachusetts near Boston is finally called up, and they go out and everybody points their guns and yells at each other. And eventually, Daniel Shays and his folks are dispersed. What happens to him doesn't matter for this class, but long story short, Daniel Shays disappears from history. Like, 2 guys are hanged, and then I think they have their, or are going, or sentenced to be hanged and have their sentences commuted, and everybody else just sort of heads back to their farms with no evidence of their delinquent taxes because they destroyed them all. The key for this is not really this stuff. This is just showing that one state didn't have all of its ducks in a row. This is the key for Shays' rebellion right here, and why we link it to the Articles of Confederation. Is they're starting to head to Philadelphia to talk about the need for a new constitution, and they're looking over their shoulders being like, okay, we've got to get this done now, because what happens if the militia hadn't showed up outside of Boston? Does this catch and spread to, Rhode Island and New York and Connecticut and to Pennsylvania and spread across the country and have the government basically overthrown due to too high taxes? We don't want that, and there's no way to stop it if it had happened at a national level, right? Because, remember, there's no standing army. They're supposed to run a national army, but oops, it's not there, and even if they wanted one, they can't tax anybody effectively to pay for it. So, Shays' Rebellion is the canary in the coal mine for the Articles of Confederation. Things are going bad, and they need to change quickly. We need to write a constitution instead. So, we're going to call, let's go through the Constitutional Convention in this video. It follows along. So, previously, in 1786, another convention had been called. This was called the Annapolis Convention. You can write that down. Not everybody shows up. Literally 5 out of 13 states show up. And this was an attempt to fix the Articles of Confederation. And Alexander Hamilton is the guy who kind of runs the show and sees this very much as proof positive that, okay, look, we can't just fix the Articles of Confederation. They're too broken at this point. We cannot unbreak this. So we need a fresh start instead. So May 25th, 1787, every state except for Rhode Island sends representatives to Philadelphia. They have various bailiwicks given to them by their state. So some states are like, hey, we just want you to go and watch. Others are like, no, you run this, you represent our state hard and make sure that this new constitution is going to work. We will see repeatedly throughout this class that Rhode Island really kind of drags its feet on everything and is just going to be sort of a contrarian for the sake of being a contrarian. They're giant babies about this. They're not like South Carolina bad, as we will talk about, well, not really this year, but you remember U.S. history, South Carolina sucks. So Rhode Island, just kind of lurking in the background. So 55 delegates are sent, and no shock to anybody, either then or probably today. It's 55 middle-aged, all white males. There's a couple in their mid-20s. Most of them are somewhere in their mid-30s to late 40s. George Washington is elected to run the session, but that's just because everybody agrees that they like George Washington. He does not particularly want the job and really would much rather be back at his his plantation with his wife, Martha. If you want, there's literally letters and letters and letters that he sends him, and everybody's like, oh, look, George Washington sent all these letters to his wife, and it's like, no, it's very detailed stuff about like the day-to-day running of the plantation, as well as some truly horrible stuff about the way he treated his slaves. But anyway, for the sake of our class, we're going to skip over that for now. James Madison and Alexander Hamilton are going to run the show here. They have great ideas for this, and also Thomas Jefferson, at this point, as it says, is away in Paris, hanging out with the French and really psyched about the overthrow of the French government there. And he does not want this to happen. He's all for the Articles of Confederation and, is kind of a giant hypocrite when it comes to that, considering the Louisiana Purchase, but that's neither here nor there. So Madison and Hamilton are here to talk up federalism, and here is your definition right here. A strong central government, states that run themselves but are beholden to that central government. We will have various other more in-depth definitions of federalism later, but for our purposes here, this is what you need to know about federalism. We have a strong central government, so we want to write what are the issues we saw last time. Form a standing army, be able to tax, be able to enact legislation, have representatives, have a chief executive. Now, the states are still going to have power to govern themselves. We are not going to take all the power away from those states. Remember, back to the philosophy stuff, right? an absolute ruler is antithetical to the sort of government we want to set up here. So states are still going to have power. But at the end of the day, they're still beholden to that central government. If there is a question of who's in charge, according to federalism, the states have to subordinate themselves to the central government. And as I said, Thomas Jefferson, not a fan, writes some very kind of snippy letters back to the rest of the founders, and they're like, all right, Tom, you're over in Paris. Maybe you should shut up. He'll continue to send his letters. No, I'm not going to talk about the Hamilton musical. I don't like musicals. Musicals make me uncomfortable. The Ron Chernow book is pretty good, but honestly, out of all the Ron Chernow books I've read, it might be the weakest one. The Grant one is the best. Anyway, moving on. So, our big three Federalists are James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and First Justice of the Supreme Court, John Jay. John Jay does not get a lot of love here simply because he's more of a background player. He is interested in the judiciary, but for the most part, he just is kind of a voice for the Federalists from the North. John Jay's from New York, whereas Madison and Hamilton are both from Virginia. So, these are our big three Federalists. We want a strong government. We saw what the problem with a weak government under the Articles of Confederation was. They want to make the country strong as well. American shipping at this time is getting just absolutely whooped on by the British. There's impressment, all that stuff that leads to the War of 1812 is still happening now. They want to be a strong enough country that we're not going to have our borders picked at. There's still turf battles with Spain on the Florida kind of Georgia-Alabama line there. We don't want that. So we need to be able to have that standing army to bulk up our country and show that we are not to be trifled with. We don't want any more Shays' Rebellion, another reason for that army, and to enforce policy. Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Locke are the three authors that they're going to rely on here. As I said, Hobbes is sort of a jumping off point with the state of nature and the need for an executive, a strong executive, but that's as far as he's going to go. Hobbes is way too much of a monarchist to be relied on here. Madison is going to use the other three that we talked about way, way, way more. Now, this is important here. We want to establish a nationwide judiciary. States should not be the only ones with laws. We need laws for the entire country as well. So you can't just hop over a state line and be like, haha, I haven't broken any laws anymore. So that's a key. We're going to have that. We will read that later on. One of your documents will regard the creation of the judiciary. Big one. There's a reason it's bold, folks. The ability to tax at a federal level. We need to pay for a national military. We need to pay for stuff to get done. States no longer get to blow us off. We can pay for the entire country. This is extra important because one of the things Hamilton, the father of American finance and really one of the fathers of modern capitalism, is going to come up with is debt is not a bad thing. You need to pay off your debts. Because if you don't pay off your debts, then people know you don't pay off your debts, and then you don't get loans anymore. So one of the things Hamilton forces the Founding Fathers to do and forces the Constitutional Convention to accept is that America will pay off its debts from prior to the Constitution being enacted. So we'll pay off our war debts. And that shows that we have good credit as a nation and we can engage in international business, which is a major thing for the United States and very, very, very important. And how are we going to pay that off? Taxes. Taxes are so important. We want to hear from a plurality of voices. Madison is going to argue for a strength in diversity. One of the fears of the Anti-Federalists is going to be that there will not be enough diverse voices and a couple people will take over. So we'll talk about that later as well. And then lastly, checks and balances. This is what the entirety of Unit 2 is really going to be on, is checks and balances. The executive is not a monolith. The judiciary and the legislative branch are not monoliths. They have to work together on this because if they don't, nobody gets anything done. And federalism is a great way to make sure that happens. And it's not just between the three branches of government. There are checks and balances between the states and the federal government too. This is thought out. It's incredibly well thought out. On the other side here, we've got the Anti-Federalists. You've got, from left to right on the bottom, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry of Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death fame, George Mason of George Mason basketball fame, and Robert E. Lee's dad, Light Horse Harry Lee. So, these guys, you might notice, they're all from Virginia, which is the richest state and the biggest state at this time. They are very afraid of a monarchy or a tyranny. And so they're like, the best way to do this is just to not give anybody any power. Let's stick with the Articles of Confederation. Maybe we can work a thing out here or there. But long story short, we don't want to have any national government because that would mean that other people from other states would have an influence on what happens, in this case, in the state of Virginia. They don't want that. They don't want North Carolina having any say with Virginia. They don't want Pennsylvania or Maryland having any say with Virginia. They want to run Virginia as its own mini country, essentially. So they're also afraid for the little guy. At least that is the argument here. That by allowing for federal taxation, so taxation at a national level, the people could be economically exploited because they're compelled, and the state is compelled, to back up the federal government on this, pay taxes that might be exorbitant and bankrupt the people. So they're saying, hey, we could avoid this because states know how much the people can be taxed, but the federal government, because it's speaking for everybody, might not have a great concept of how much in taxes someone from South Carolina could pay. So let's just not do that. Strong judiciary. There's a fear that it's going to override state laws and render them inert or useless. Basically, bit by bit, just eat away at state laws until they can't accomplish anything. This is one of the major arguments we're going to see when we read Brutus later on. And then lastly, this is kind of what we talked about with taxation, just kind of blown up to a larger level, is that national government is going to get so big that smaller states and minority groups just aren't going to have a voice anymore. They will be drowned out by the popular will, and then they'll get screwed over. So the Anti-Federalists are very, very afraid of that large national voice because, oh no, what happens to us, someone with a different point of view, when everyone else, is united under one voice? So that's the argument out of the Anti-Federalists. And we are going to wrap up here. Our next one will go over sort of the philosophical basis of the Declaration of Independence for a little bit and the Constitution. So that's it for now. Hope you enjoyed. Talk to y'all later.